My next guest is often mistaken for Danielle Evans from America's Next Top Model. Well, there are two similarities with the two women. Their names, and both are burning up the pages. But the Danielle Evans joining me today is burning up the literary world. Her latest book, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, is getting lots of praise. Welcome to Washington Watch, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, glad you're here. Now, this is your first book, but you're not a virgin, if you will, to the literary world. Your particular piece, Virgins, was accepted by the Paris Review, and also Salman Rushdie included one of your essays in his book, American Short Stories of 2008. With this particular book here, what is interesting, although it's a work of fiction, it does really deal with this whole issue of how folks are trying to fit into these different cultures and classes from mixed backgrounds. And so how did you come around to pulling this whole thing together to sort of speak to that audience?
Well, I had started before I really knew what I was doing, which I think is the only reason anyone would ever start writing fiction. And I was just writing stories because that was what I wanted to do, and I wasn't thinking about them necessarily as a collection until later on when I was picking, what goes together and makes this a book. And part of what was interesting to me about this cultural moment is that there are, I think in some sense there's almost been an immigration experience for some African American families post-integration, post-civil rights, in terms of the distinction in the experience between children and parents and the sorts of possibilities and encounters that happen all the time that didn't happen before. So I was thinking in some sense about what it means to be a person who has to translate, who has to navigate between worlds, and who has to navigate between worlds where the experience of race is often much more intimate.
Your experiences, your background is also a part of this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're writing fiction, you're inhabiting people's heads, and so all of the people are going to end up being a little bit like you.
Let me ask you this here. I want your reaction to this notion that we're living in a post-racial America.
I mean, I think we're clearly not. We're living in a somewhat differently racial America, but even the fact that there's this incessant conversation about post-racial and what that means in and of itself sort of says that we're not past anything yet. And
right.
there's this weird thing where, and I think that's part of what I'm thinking about too with these characters, some of whom have been posited as exceptional or successful, because it's like, oh, well, you can point to a couple of figureheads, and so at the same time, we have this incredibly widening class gap. We have a tremendous education gap. There are a lot of markers that have not really moved as far as we would like to have seen them moved since the gains of the civil rights movement. And in some sense, what's happened is the black middle class has been removed from the larger black community in certain kinds of ways, or asked to be kind of emissaries back and forth, but there isn't an entire total community shift. And so I think that there are, like I said, new possibilities, interesting possibilities, but certainly we're not past the point where we need to think about and talk about race.
Well, I'll tell you what, one of the things that I appreciate, even when it comes to whether it's fiction and nonfiction with your book, is that it allows us to deal with many of the thorny issues we don't really like to talk about, that we also have to confront. Danielle, we certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, folks, the book is called Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, so be sure to check it out. That's what it looks like, and so be sure to get your copy.